Ебать того Люсю! Блядь!
For months, Donald Trump had been telling the international community,
I said, you don't have the cards. Don't forget, I inherited this war. I would have never, this war never would have happened. I inherited this war. And I thought he should have made a deal.
Vladimir Putin, drawing strength from Trump's words, was pressuring the Kiev government to surrender. But at that time, Volodymyr Zelensky was showing his cards to Putin and Trump in the loudest way possible. And now Moscow is turning into a battlefield. What you see here is the Shatura Thermal Power Plant, one of Moscow's most critical energy centers, struck by Ukraine's long-range suicide drones. Witnesses filmed Russian soldiers attempting to shoot down drones attacking the Shatura power plant from the windows of their hotel in Shatura. Muscovites woke up to the sight of destroyed power plants. But it didn't end there. In the morning, the facility was attacked again. Zelensky was playing his cards richly and plunging Putin's Moscow dream into darkness. In new images taken on social media in the morning, it can be seen that Ukrainian drones destroyed the Shatura power plant in the Moscow region in the second attack. This location is just 120 kilometers from the Kremlin. The people of Moscow woke up that morning not only to the smell of smoke, but also to the reality that the state had failed to protect them. Attacks are usually carried out in a single wave and then end. However, when the facility came under attack again in the morning, Ukraine caught Russian repair crews and emergency response units off guard. This attack, carried out right in the heart of Russian air defenses, completely destroys Vladimir Putin's claim to credibility. This action is the loudest way of saying, I have many more cards to play. So where was Putin at this time? Look, he was standing camouflaged in an underground shelter. This image did not convey the image of a victorious leader at all. For the Russian people, this was the rat in the shelter syndrome. Now, the cost of the great war Putin is losing has gone beyond the coffins of soldiers coming from the front. The cost is being cut into the daily lives of ordinary people in the very heart of Russia, into their winter heating security. Ukraine's drones did not just hit transformers with a capacity of 1,500 megawatts. The Shatura Thermal Power Plant is not only a critical facility for generating electricity, it also provides heat to the Moscow region. The people of Moscow are now left in the dark and cold in the middle of winter. The massive fire that erupted after the attack directly impacted the power transmission lines connected to the unified energy system. Factories, metro lines, hospitals, and millions of homes. All came to a sudden halt. The images of fresh smoke, fire, and chaos circulating on social media have completely eroded public trust in the state. The Russian economy is already on the brink of collapse. The losses are driving the people crazy, and the risk of internal unrest is looming. Power outages will deepen this economic crisis by creating a strangulation effect on production and supply chains. Considering that the plant's capacity is 1,500 megawatts, the withdrawal of this power from the system will crush everything from industrial production to daily life. This chaotic environment directly weakens Vladimir Putin's efforts to maintain his power. Yet Putin was trying to flex his muscles by approaching Washington's 28-point peace plan with an attitude that said, "I'm still in control." Donald Trump may see Putin's hand as strong from perhaps 10,000 kilometers away. However, Zelensky's attacks targeting energy lines have painfully revealed that Russia is not as strong as it thought. Now, let's go back to the day that 28-point plan was first published. Because Ukraine had actually responded immediately with the cards it had in its hand. The war reached the heart of Russia, from Ryazan to Moscow, from Kursk to Oryol, on November 19th to 20th. What you see here is not just a drone attack, it is a lightning strike against Putin's empire and his narrative of victory. Because the target was Ryazan, one of Russia's largest oil refineries and the main lifeline supplying Moscow. This refinery was struck a total of 8 times throughout the year, and the attacks have completely halted operations at the Ryazan refinery. The main bridge supplying 40% of Moscow's fuel had been cut off. The capital was forced to immediately close its airports due to security concerns. In Kursk, over 16,000 people were left without electricity. An attack was also carried out on the Ryazan Thermal Power Plant that same night. Now let's turn our lens to beneath Moscow, into those cold, concrete structures. While Vladimir Putin tells the world the fairy tale of superpower Russia on Russian state television, where is he? In the Kremlin's gilded halls? No. The leader who tells the public everything is under control speaks from an underground bunker, his voice trembling, wearing military camouflage, while Shatura and Ryazan burn. This image is not that of a leader, but of a cornered fugitive. Why does the leader of a superpower hold important strategic meetings in a bunker, as if a missile could strike at any moment? Because he is afraid. While Zelensky drinks tea with his soldiers on the front lines, Putin hides in his own capital, from his own people, and from Ukrainian drones. This contrast has crushed the myth of the strong leader in the eyes of the Russian people. The Russian people now see this. The man who drove them to war is hiding meters underground in his specially ventilated safe room while they freeze in the cold. This is the rat in the bunker syndrome. And history teaches us that when a dictator starts going into a bunker, it means the regime's expiration date has passed. Putin is freaking out in the face of Ukraine's long-range strike capabilities, and this fear is spreading like a virus among the generals in the chain of command. What happens when the fear in the bunker meets the anger in the streets? Chaos. Russia's home front is collapsing faster than Ukraine's missiles. The massive logistical beast that feeds Putin's war machine, Russian Railways, RZD, has raised the white flag. 700,000 railway workers. Russia's largest army of workers is now turning its back on Putin. Unpaid wages, lack of parts, and excessive working conditions have driven this massive workforce into a silent rebellion. If the railways stop, Russia stops. Because Russia is not a road country, it is a railway empire. Coal from Siberia, tanks from the Urals, ammunition heading to the front. All move along those tracks, and now those tracks are rusting. This is the concrete reality behind headlines like, "Civil War is brewing." Frozen mothers in Moscow's suburbs, unemployed refinery workers in Ryazan, and railway personnel who haven't been paid. For these people, victory or Donbass are now meaningless words. For them, there is only one reality: freezing homes, empty refrigerators, and a lying president. The number of soldiers leaking information from within has exceeded 5% of the total personnel. This is the threshold at which an army experiences moral collapse. Russian soldiers are now preparing to point their guns not at Ukraine, but at their own commanders. Amidst all this chaos, Volodymyr Zelensky and the Ukrainian General Staff are implementing a doctrine that will go down in modern war history: asymmetric dominance. While Putin thought Ukraine had run out of cards, Zelensky changed the deck. The war is no longer trench warfare on the front lines. The war is being fought in Russia's strategic depth across the entire geography. Ukraine's Palyarnytsia, missile drone hybrids and long-range systems have turned every point from Sakhalin Island in Russia's far east to Kaliningrad in the west into a legitimate target. The basis of this Zelensky doctrine is this: don't waste time defeating the enemy on the front lines. Destroy the system that allows the enemy to come to the front. 1. Energy blindness. Blind the S-400s by hitting the power plants that feed the radars. 2. Economic bleeding. Collapse the ruble and exports by hitting the refineries. 3. Psychological pressure. Strike Moscow to shatter the myth of invulnerability. When Zelensky sits down at the table, he doesn't just have land demands in his hand. He has the threat of completely shutting down Russia's energy infrastructure. What Putin fails to understand is this: Ukraine is no longer defending itself. Ukraine is hunting down the Russian state's existential infrastructure. The hunter has become the hunted. What Putin trembles over in that bunker is not just Ukrainian missiles. His real nightmare is that terrible historical cycle ingrained in Russia's genetic code. Russian history teaches us one immutable truth. The Russian people are incredibly patient, yes, but when that patience cracks, the energy that emerges is not a protest, but an unstoppable volcanic eruption. Russia's social memory is haunted by the ghosts of 1917. Tsar Nicholas II, just like Putin, sat in his palace, believing he was managing a small and victorious war at the front. Yet when women began shouting, "Bread!" in the streets of St. Petersburg, the Tsar's massive army, police force, and intelligence apparatus collapsed. Why? Because hunger and cold always defeat patriotic propaganda. What is happening in Russia today is a war between the television and the refrigerator. And the refrigerator always wins this war. The current picture is a frightening mix of 1917 and 1991. Throughout history, the Russian people have rebelled against two things: being humiliated in a meaningless war, as was the case against the Japanese in 1905, the Germans in 1917, and Afghanistan in 1989. What is happening today against Ukraine is the humiliation of a superpower by its small neighbor. This inflicts an irreparable wound on Russian national pride. The state's failure to meet basic needs, houses freezing in the heart of Moscow, butter and eggs missing from the shelves. These simple shortages are the greatest spark of revolutions. When Moscow turns into a war zone, the Great Russia propaganda is shattered. At that moment, fear gives way to pure rage. Putin's biggest mistake is seeing the Russian people as a mass of endless obedience. When the people outside have nothing left to lose, even the thickest shelter doors turn into paper castles. Russia's hour of rebellion has been set, and its ticking is now echoing in the corridors of the Kremlin. This is the terminal stage of a regime. Putin's tactical collapse on the front lines is combined with a massive strategic blow he has suffered in the diplomatic arena. The Kremlin hoped that Trump's election would lead to the collapse of the Western Bloc. However, the opposite has happened. Europe has awakened the sleeping giant. Donald Trump may see Putin's hand as strong from perhaps 10,000 kilometers away, but European capitals have X-rayed Russia and seen only one thing: systemic multiple organ failure. Russia is now completely cornered. Why? Because the myth of sustainable war has collapsed. The Russian people are fed up with a government that can no longer hide the enormous scale of the losses. Every coffin arriving from the front turns the silent anger in society into a powder keg. Economic data shows that Russia cannot survive until 2026 with its current war economy, and that inflation and labor shortages are pushing the country toward the risk of an actual civil war. The potential uprising of 700,000 railway workers is a sign that Russia's logistical arteries are clogged. This is where Putin's fatal mistake lies. He wants this agreement not as a trophy of victory, but as a lifeline to save his regime. By holding on to the occupied territories, he hopes to quell domestic nationalist anger and be able to say, "It was worth it." However, Europe and Ukraine see this equation very clearly. They know that if Putin leaves the table now, he will never be able to return with the same military capacity. Therefore, Putin's demand to freeze the current lines is actually a veiled declaration of accepting defeat. In Europe's eyes, the situation is clear. Putin's hand is weak, his army is exhausted, and his people are at breaking point. In such a scenario, rewarding him with territory would be not only morally wrong, but also strategically foolish. Putin is looking for an exit adorned with the trappings of victory. However, Europe is determined not to give him that exit. Why does Washington say agreement, while Kiev strikes Moscow, and Berlin and Warsaw say prepare for war? Because there is a memory gap between the two sides of the Atlantic as deep as the oceans. For Washington, the Cold War was a theory. For Europe, Russian occupation is a lived experience. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland. History has taught Europe one lesson. A truce with Moscow is only the starting whistle for the next occupation. Putin's chronology of power proves that this fear is mathematically certain. 2008 Georgia, 2014 Crimea, 2022 Ukraine. European intelligence knows that if Putin is rewarded today, the next target in 2027 will be the Baltics and the Suwalki corridor. At this point, the likelihood of Europe and Ukraine accepting such a surrender agreement is zero. Because Europe's memory screams, if Ukraine falls, the war will reach Berlin's doorstep. Why is Putin warm to Washington's plan? Out of pacifism? Absolutely not. Putin is on the edge of the precipice and panicking to stop the fall. The war spilling over into Russian territory, the defeats in Kursk, and the lack of progress on the front lines are shaking the Kremlin's walls. But the real fire is inside. The losses are now too great to hide, and this is freaking out the Russian people. Economic sanctions and the costs of war have brought Russia to the brink of civil war. Generals blaming each other within Russia, conflicts among the elite, and growing unrest among the people justify headlines like, "Civil war is brewing." The bottom line is clear. Vladimir Putin may be sitting at the Washington table as the winning side, but this is the greatest optical illusion in modern political history. Behind the Kremlin walls, things are not going as portrayed by the propaganda channels. The collapse of the home front, the leader in the bunker, and the awakening of Europe are leading Russia into systematic multiple organ failure. Putin's demand to freeze the current lines is not a plea for peace, but an attempt to accept defeat and play for time. But the fire burning in Shatura and the coalition being formed in London will not give Putin that time. As Moscow sinks into darkness, one question remains for the Russian people. Is it worth freezing for the man in the bunker? History shows that the answer is always no. The empire is crumbling, and even taking shelter is no longer enough to avoid hearing that sound. At PPR Global, we will continue to track every moment of this historic collapse with sources and data. Thank you for choosing us.